I would probably challenge, like, okay, can you stop? Can you actually stop? How do you feel when you try stopping? Maybe you cannot do it for a month, but how do you feel in that month?
That's where I'm going to go when I need to unwind is porn, or when I'm stressed, it's porn, or when I'm excited and I want to celebrate, it's porn. And so it becomes our go-to, and it just envelops our whole life.
Welcome to Saints and Sexuality, a podcast by FirstLight Ministries for educating ministry leaders and strugglers about the causes, aftermath, and treatment of addictive sexual behaviors. FirstLight is a St. Louis-based ministry that is dedicated to helping men, women, and betrayed spouses find freedom from the harm of sexual sin. Do I have a sex addiction? It's a question that many people who have struggled with porn or other sexual behaviors have asked themselves. In today's episode, FirstLight counselors Shari Montague and Matthew Friesen discuss the realities of sex and pornography addiction. You'll learn how to recognize the signs, why some people develop addictions, and why it can be so difficult for some people to break free. Let's get started.
So sex addiction takes the idea that addiction is something that we all could struggle with. We don't all struggle with it, but we all could struggle with it. And that can be in any area of our life. The obvious ones are alcohol and drugs. And those are clearly addiction or fall into addiction partially because we recognize the chemical dependency that's happening. So folks who are addicted to those things are addicted to the chemical reaction that happens in their brain from that substance. Others can drink alcohol and not become addicted to it, and it still alters their brain chemistry or, does the things that alcohol does in your body, but it doesn't necessarily bring you to an addiction, a place of addiction. The same is true with gambling. So we have process addiction. So gambling is a process addiction, which means, again, somebody could go gamble and not become addicted to that, but there are people who become very addicted to gambling and it becomes problematic in their life. And so we're taking that same idea and we're applying that to sex then and saying sex is also something in our lives that can be done in a way that is healthy and it can be really beautiful and wonderful, but it also can become addictive. And when we're talking about folks who have an addiction, we're talking about a few main concepts that relate to the addiction. So we're talking about people who have tried to stop doing the thing and they can't. They come back to it. That can be attempts to stop. That can be attempts to do it less, but they can't find them. They find themselves still back where they were. Often it may include escalation, which means where they started is not where they end up, or they end up doing worse things or things that they said they would never do.
Yeah, usually it grows quicker than they even anticipated.
Right.
And it's out of hand.
Exactly. It grows it grows quicker, or it goes to a place that they thought that they would never go.
And that's usually where they begin to lose control. They felt like they were in control, and then it grows, and that's when they sometimes can reach out for help. This has grown out of my
ability to
what
control.
I thought I had in control. Yeah.
Right. Another thing that we look at for addiction is the impact on the person's life. So if somebody has an addiction, we would say that thing becomes a thing that they only desire, that they everything else pales in comparison.
So relationship
becomes a priority. So relationships, work, they put that substance or that activity above that. And so we find that, again, when we go back to sex addiction, we find that with men and women who struggle with sex addiction, that they struggle with maybe using pornography or something at work. So they're putting this above their employment. Or they find that they choose not to go out with friends or go out spend time with their family because they want to be able to look at pornography or whatever other sexual activity.
Acting out. Yeah, it becomes very invasive. Just like other addictions, we'll see a physiological or an emotional and relational consequences to these behaviors. A lot of times the addiction lies dormant in that hiddenness, that secrecy for a long time. And people feel like that's the element of false control, that it's in control. Nobody really knows about it. And so they live with it until it gets so big that they can't control it. And that's usually when it becomes exposed to a spouse or children, or, like you said, if you're using it at work. And maybe lose a job. And we begin to see these things like alcohol becomes pervasive, like you're not able to function in your normal relationships. You're not able to perform at your job or communicate or have healthy relationships because this thing has just become so invasive and taken over.
Right. Secrecy plays a part in that, which you kind of touched on. So there's a sense that I do this by myself. And we know that's not true for every alcoholic. We know that there's like social alcoholics and things. But for the most part, with an addiction, there becomes a part of it that is secret. That might be, you drink socially, but then you also go home and have a glass of wine to unwind. And you don't necessarily tell people about that. You're afraid that if they know, then they would be concerned. And the same thing is true of sex addiction, although usually to a greater extent, because sex creates deeper senses of shame within us, within most people. And so we often find a great deal of secrecy around sexual behaviors. And of course, especially if there's sexual behaviors outside of the marriage that the spouse would not want to be happening, they hide it.
That's a good point. The realm of addiction that hides outside of the societal norm, having a food addiction, people have to eat. It's fairly easy to blend in, or even if you drink, if that becomes part of your social norm, a lot of that addictive behavior can become hidden really well and just, I'm drinking with friends, or addiction to your phone. Maybe it's part of work. Things like gambling, process addictions, or behavioral addictions are, usually hidden or lowered in their just how they operate. Like I don't look at porn a ton, and so these things just become hidden. But I think you touched on it. It's just this idea that that's how I cope. That's how that's where I'm going to go when I need to unwind is porn, or when I'm stressed, it's porn, or when I'm excited and I want to celebrate, it's porn, or this, this behavior. And so it becomes our go-to, and it just envelops our whole life.
Right. The idea of emotional regulation, that activity regulates our emotions.
This is what I need. And that's when it trumps my spouse or my kids or my other healthy relationships, is that I'll be with you, but what I really need is this behavior. And so we're not getting that emotional response that we should from the people that are healthy in our lives, or the relationships that are healthy in our lives.
And I can even see that a lot of people that I speak with will talk about how they use it to go to sleep. So they might masturbate before going to sleep because that's just how I fall asleep at night.
It becomes routine.
It becomes a routine, exactly. And it becomes part of the way that they are able to relax. They can't do it any other way. They don't know how to do that in any other way. So those are a few of the things we look for, at least when we're looking at what constitutes an actual addiction versus a habit. Habitual things can become a problem in a person's life. So we also care for those folks at FirstLight. We don't discriminate necessarily between if you have a sex addiction or habit or something that you're doing that you wish you weren't doing related to your sexuality. So those habits or those things are things that we'll address. Sex addiction would be at sort of the top end of the spectrum if you're looking at all those things on a spectrum. So we tend to see those as more extreme or more they're just more deeply entrenched behaviors.
What would you say to someone who feels like they haven't lost control? If they say, I see some of these behaviors, I do look at porn quite a bit, but it hasn't gotten out of control, so I don't think it's a problem yet. And they see these things as maybe markers, but they wouldn't call it an addiction yet.
I would challenge them to actually try stopping for a month and see what happens. I think would probably be the quickest route to okay, is this an addiction or is this not an addiction? And I would also say, we're splitting at that point. If a person is saying it's not a problem, we're actually splitting hairs because it actually is a problem. If they're, if, especially as a Christian, wanting to live a life holy before the Lord, then that is still unwanted sexual behaviors or any behaviors that are against what we would say is a biblical view
outside
of sex.
Of that marriage.
Right. So if it's something outside of the marriage bed, then you're at a point of already doing something you ought not to be doing. But if somebody, so I would say we're splitting hairs, but if somebody asks the question, I would probably challenge, like, okay, can you stop? Can you actually stop? How do you feel when you try stopping? Maybe you can do it for a month, or cannot do it for a month. But how do you feel in that month? Are you restless? Are you anxious? Or do you have heightened senses of like sadness or frustration or irritability?
Are you able to regulate safely?
Exactly. And if you're not able to regulate safely, I would say, okay, you're probably pretty reliant on this activity.
Yeah. I see a lot of times in conversations with men, the comparison is the thief for actually seeking help, is that I'm not as bad as that guy. Or I've seen guys who are worse off. And so, yes, I probably masturbate more than I should, or yes, I look at porn, or I had this emotional thing with a coworker, but it never went physical. And so these confines of what they find to be, quote unquote, not as bad, can sometimes lead to that escalation and lead to out of control. How do we, kind of touch those guys and say, hey, this is something that we can address now before it gets out of hand?
And I think the justifications are the internal justifications. If you're finding that you have a behavior, whatever the behavior is, that you have that you defend internally, or that you have to say internally, well, it's not doing this, or it's not doing that, or it's not that bad, but I could be doing this instead.
When it becomes a problem,
I'll do something. Then you're in dangerous waters, regardless of whether we would call that an addiction or not. That's splitting hairs.
Yeah. What if we tackled this before it became an addiction?
Right.
Like, we don't want to wait for it to become so out of hand or out of control that we say, imagine what we could have been doing this work a year ago.
Right. Which I have a lot of people that come to me will say that, wow, I wish I had started this earlier.
I think that's the battle of shame, especially within the church, is the enemy of that. To come forward and say, it's not an addiction. My spouse doesn't know about it yet. I haven't been exposed, but man, what would it be like if I got help now? And I feel like that shame and that fear and that guilt, maybe of if somebody finds out, maybe I lose my position at work, or my kids won't respect me, or my wife won't respect me. And so we attempt to beat it on our own, and we attempt to control it. I guess it's, it goes back to that element of control, that I can do this. And so, challenging someone to stop. Say, what if you didn't do that before bed, or every time your wife left, or every time you found yourself alone? What would it be like to change that behavior now?
Yeah.
But there is an element of shame and fear that just goes into this hiddenness and drives men and women into this closet of just dealing with this alone.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think that as people, we just naturally recognize sex and sexuality as a part of our lives that is intended to be private, maybe is the way to say that, or intended to be special and intended to only be shared with a few people or one person and your spouse. And so I think there's a natural move away from sharing about it regularly. I think in the church, we see that even more deeply, because in the church, we strive to be faithful to what Scripture has said, and we want to be holy. And so sharing about those things that we do actually struggle with, particularly if it's sexual in nature, can be scary. And not everybody knows how to respond to it. It can be a scary topic, which is also why some people don't talk about it, because their parents responded poorly, or their parents never had the sex talk with them, or their parents weren't open about it, or they were taught just by the way that their parents interacted around sex that it was something they couldn't talk about. Yeah.
I'm afraid of how you're going to respond.
Right. And so, or I got punished, or, whatever. There's lots of different stories around that. And then you add in sexual abuse as a piece that a lot of our folks have actually experienced in some way. And so you add in the deeper shame component of sexual abuse, and you've got the shame upon shame that adds to the struggle to actually to even come forward with it, let alone be able to actually deal with it.
It's interesting sitting with clients and unpacking some of that didn't even realize that there was sexual abuse in their story until they sit down and actually process it, that relationship was inappropriate, or these requests were abuse of power. over my
Yes.
sexual autonomy or my own body.
Yes.
And once they begin sitting down and writing it and processing it,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes this awareness that,
Yes.
holy cow, this really was there all along. This makes sense now.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a deficit for men in particular with that. I think there's some for women as well, and there's a couple of reasons for that too. But I think for men, we don't talk about sexual abuse as much for men, and so women are have done more work to identify the abuse that they experience in men. So for many of our male clients, that's true. They'll come in and start unpacking some things, and then we go, oh, this was actually part of my story, and I didn't realize how that. And then that informs, of course, how they view sex for the rest of their lives.
Totally.
Which I think is one of the things too that we need to pay attention to in the church, and why this isn't just this is just a surface sort of issue that you can hand them a book or tell them you're praying for them, or even just an accountability group doesn't really address this, because it's talking about the behavior or addressing the behavior, which is important, but it's not addressing the deeper issues that are underlying the behavior. And all of the people that come to us, regardless of whether they would be diagnosed as a true sex addict or whether they just have some behaviors that they don't want to be doing, sexual behaviors that they don't want to be doing, for all of them, there is an unpacking of thoughts and feelings and beliefs around sex, around relationships, that makes it something that can't just be addressed by some prayer and some, just trying not to do it anymore.
I think we see the power of therapy creating that safe space for them to unpack and explore some of those things that it's safe nowhere else.
Right. Exactly.
Maybe even in their own marriage.
Right.
And
exactly.
we want to rebuild that trust. And sometimes that trust is shaken. That foundation of trust and intimacy is just broken because of, sexual brokenness. But in the therapy room, in the office, we can sit and actually just create that space for them to be honest and just really test the boundaries of, someone who's going to listen and not judge, not compare, not put condemnation. And I think that still instills that fear, sadly, still within the church, even within a small group or a pastor's office, is you're not sure what you're going to get. Are they going to look at me differently? Are they going to think about me differently if I, bring this up? Can I still work in the youth group, or can I still be a deacon or an elder, or serve in this capacity? And there's a lot of fear that goes with, how's my life going to change if I'm honest with myself?
Right. And that's important, but it's actually good for your life to change.
Yeah.
In a way that
absolutely.
it's hard to hear that, but it is
you might
good
need to see some change from that. Yeah.
Right. You might actually need to step down from whatever you're doing at the church so you can address this issue. But you're right that we, in therapy, then we create the space for them to unpack it and be able to address what's going on underneath the sexual behavior. So very few, or if any, of our behaviors in our lives in general are just what they seem.
Right.
We all have motives and thoughts and feelings that go behind that.
Deep roots.
That are deep roots, right? And so that's one of the things that we're really addressing in therapy then is what are the roots of this? What brought you here in the first place? What brought you to this addiction? What was your first sexual experience? How did that inform how you view sex now? What has sex been like with your spouse? What does it mean for you to have sex? Many of the men that we see in FirstLight believe that sex is the only way they feel loved. So if their wife is going through a period of time where she can't have sex or chooses not to have sex with them for whatever reason, they feel like they aren't loved.
Yeah.
And that's that makes me so sad, because there are so many ways to feel loved, and to be given love. And sex is only one of them.
Yeah.
And if that's the only way you know how to receive love, one of the major things we're working on is how do you become a better receiver of love, and love others better.
Yeah. Addressing that issue and the difference between need and want is so huge with men and women. What you need to survive, and just kind of changing our terminology a little bit to be like, I want sex and I want that sex relationship, and it's innate in us as image bearers, that God created something beautiful for us. but it's not a need that we will, we can't survive without it. Being able to engage with
Right.
your spouse in different ways is a muscle that some guys have just never exercised. Like, I don't know
Right.
how to engage with my wife if it's not preceded or followed by sexual activity. And that's so damaging
Exactly.
to that relationship.
Yeah. Well, and it puts a lot of pressure on the wife to be sexual, even if she's not feeling it, or doesn't want it or can't have it.
Yeah, there's so many
reasons. And it ultimately makes that an idol. It doesn't, it maybe doesn't feel like an idol, but it is an idol then, because that's the only thing where I feel loved and validated. And that's what we're intended to do when we worship. That's, that's ultimately what we get from God, but also should be getting from our community, church community and family. But that creates that as an idol.
There's that commonality between addiction and idol worship, is that we've put something above what's actually important. The idolatry above God, the addiction before our relationship, to say that I value you because of our sexual relationship. And now that that's gone, so goes the value, which is so damaging to obviously marital relationships, but just any relationship. And putting something intrinsically valuable on something like sex. Yeah, that connection between idolatry and addiction is so real.
It is time for questions and comments, the part of the episode where our guest answers questions from the community. Today, our question is, how much porn can I safely use?
So the idea that pornography can be used at all is a misuse of our bodies and a misuse of what God calls us to, and a misunderstanding of holiness. So we're asking the question, when we ask that question, we're asking, how far can I go? How far can I move towards sin without sinning? How far can I move toward the danger zone without getting, how far can I walk into the street without getting hit by a car? That's the wrong question to be asking. The question ought to be, how can I be holy? How can I care for myself in the best way possible? And and the answer to that, I believe, is no pornography. That it's not good for your soul. It is not good for you to consume it. There's many reasons for that. There's the objectification of other people that's happening when you view pornography. There's the misuse of your body, both chemically in your brain, the misuse of those chemicals to give you something that you shouldn't be getting unless you're in relationship with another human being. There's the misuse of your physical body by self-pleasuring, masturbating. So you're misusing your own self as well as misusing the people that you're viewing when you're looking at pornography. And so I would say, again, no pornography is acceptable.
Right.
Now, especially for developing brains. So it is particularly dangerous to people from the ages of, 8, 5, 4 babies. Yeah. To those who are 25 or 30. So we know that brains are still developing up until that age, and it is particularly damaging to those brains. I would say it could be less damaging once you have established a sexual relationship. Once your sexuality is imprinted already, and you're able to see it as something outside of yourself and not, but again, you've got the issues of sexual, of objectification.
You'll just handle it differently.
Yeah. That would be maybe the way to say that. And again, there's still the, are you looking at it by yourself, or are you looking at it with your spouse? What does that do? Those are all questions that I wonder about, but
I want to play an advocate and just to say that there's also a definition of terms. In the world we live in, we're saturated with sexually explicit images. And so when we think of pornography, define your terms. Have you seen a billboard or a TV show or a movie that you weren't really seeking it out? And I don't want to put that sin on a person who may be, acted upon And so if you feel like you've wronged your spouse or you've wronged somebody because something was given to you or thrusted upon you,
Sure.
We often hear about that in childhood trauma, that it starts so young that it's
It was
abuse.
unwanted.
It was unwanted sexual imaging, whether it's through a video or a picture or in person. Somebody exposes themselves, or you see something on your dad's computer, or you find your uncle's magazine collection. And so I don't want someone to feel this guilt for something that was done to them. And so no porn is good porn.
Right.
But, if you were acted upon, especially or taken advantage of in a way that was an imbalance of power, I don't want you to feel that shame or carry that shame and walk with that you've somehow done something wrong. That was the sin of somebody else who acted upon you.
Right.
And you are not to blame for that issue, those struggles, those images that maybe in your head years later was something that is part of the fall. We are acted in sin and upon us and upon others. And so, just to define terms, we live in a very pornographic world.
True.
So if you're seeking out porn and sexually explicit images for your own pleasure, no porn is good.
And anything that is sexually arousing would be included in that. So that might be a Victoria's Secret catalog, or that might be swimsuits,
or fetishes,
models,
or just anything that maybe is blind to other people.
Right.
If you're arousing yourself through it, it's an inappropriate connection.
This has been Saints in Sexuality. Please subscribe, comment, and share to support this podcast. FirstLight Ministries is a nonprofit funded by the generosity of our donors. If you would like to support FirstLight Ministries or host a FirstLight speaker at your church, visit www.firstlightstlouis.org.